pheromones. And one of the reasons that beekeepers use smoke is that there's an alarm pheromone that the bees give off when they get agitated. And that just gets the rest of the hive agitated. So what we do before we open it up, we want to give them a little smoke, cool smoke. Do a little smoke at the entrance. And we lift the top. This is called the outer cover. And this is the inner cover, which is ventilated. The smoke also makes the bees think that their hive is on fire, or there's a forest fire nearby. So what they do is they gorge themselves on honey, anticipating that they're going to have to leave. And when they have a belly full of honey, they get really docile, kind of like people are at Thanksgiving. After Thanksgiving dinner, what do we want to do? We want to go lay on the couch and fall asleep, right? You don't want to go pick a fight. So that's pretty much the same thing with bees. So under the inner cover, what you're going to see is this is called burr comb. The bees love to build comb anywhere that they can. And the reason that they don't build the frames together is that they're spaced at exactly 3/8 of an inch, which is called the bee space. Okay, so bees, if it's 3/8 of an inch apart, they won't attach these two frames together. They'll leave a gap there so that they can work both sides of the frame. So the spacing is pretty important. All right, eventually we're going to go and we're going to see if we can't find the queen, but I want to talk to you a little bit about how the hive is made up. The bees are very particular about how they set the hive up. So what we have here is this is an empty frame, and what we've put in it is a piece of foundation. Foundation is just a template that we give the bees so that they can draw their cells out. All right, most beekeepers are pretty neurotic. They want the cells to be all pretty and uniform, and so they have to give the bees something to build it on. But if you leave bees alone and you had no foundation, they would do just as good a job building comb by themselves. So some beekeepers use foundation, some beekeepers don't. All right, on this frame, we've got a couple of things going on. First, what you've got here is, this is partially drawn foundation. So the bees have started to put the wax down and to make the individual cells. You can see the yellow wax against the black background. Okay? So the bees use these wax cells for two different things. One is to raise young, and two is to store food. They store pollen and they store honey. So what we've got on this side is, this is capped honey. So this is honey. Honey is made from nectar. The bees go out and they collect nectar from the plants. They bring it into the hive and they evaporate water from the nectar and turn it into honey. When it reaches 17% water, that's when they cap it. And capped honey is virtually, will last forever. Okay, there's really nothing that can grow in it. It doesn't go bad. Matter of fact, they found honey in the pyramids that was still edible.
Wow.
Okay, on the next frame, we're going to try to find the queen now. The queen is not marked in here, so she's a little bit harder to find, but I think we can do it. If we can't find her in here, in our observation hive on the table, we've got her marked with a blue dot, make it a little bit easier to see. So this is, again, a frame of honey. A full frame of honey can weigh about 10 pounds. So a full box is about 100 pounds when it's full of honey. See, I don't see the queen on here. I don't think she's on this one. Let me talk to you a little bit about the different kinds of bees that are in the hive. So there's basically 3 different kinds of bees in the hive. There's the queen bee, and there's only one queen bee in each hive. She's the mother of all the other bees that are in the hive, okay? Her only job is to lay eggs. She mates once early in her life, and then she doesn't leave the hive after that. She lays anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 eggs a day at the height of the season, okay? Queens live anywhere from 3 to 8 years. Most beekeepers keep their queens or have productive queens for 1 to 3 years. So some beekeepers replace the queen every year. Some beekeepers replace it every 2 years. Some beekeepers, like me, let the bees decide when it's time to replace the queen. So what happens is when the queen starts laying less eggs than the rest of the bees think is required, they get together and they say, you know what, it's time for the old lady to go. And what they do is they start raising a new queen. And what happens is when the new queen breaks out, she fights with the old queen and she usually wins. And you've got now a young, vigorous queen again. So the bees know when things aren't right and they know when it's time to have a new queen. The other bees that are in the hive, and most of the ones that you're seeing here, are worker bees. All right, worker bees are infertile females.
Okay.
All right, so the majority of the bees that are in the hive are the worker bees. The worker bees live about 4 to 6 weeks in the summer. They spend the first 3 weeks of their life in the hive. They don't leave the hive. What they do is they clean the cells, they feed the larvae. There even are some bees that are designated as undertaker bees, and they go around collecting the dead bodies and throwing them out of the hive. But for the first 3 weeks, they don't leave the hive. At the end of that 3 weeks, they go out for their first flight outside the hive. And of course, the first thing they need to do is understand where the hive is, so when they come back from foraging, they know how to get home. So what they do is, you'll see them, it's called orienting. They'll be flying kind of in a mass back and forth, judging where the hive is in relationship to the sun to understand where it is that they have to come back to. So it's really a spectacle to see. You see all of these new young bees out in front of the hive trying to learn where home is. Okay? So for the last 3 weeks, they go out and they forage. They collect basically 4 different things. They collect nectar to make honey. They collect pollen, and pollen is the protein source that they feed to the babies. Okay? They ferment the pollen into something that we call bee bread, and I'll show you on one of the frames, you can see the yellow bee bread in there. I'll point that out to you. Oh, there it is. So this is bee bread down here in the right. Now this is very typical pollen because it's yellow, and we all have seen yellow pollen before. But pollen comes in many, many different colors. So pollen comes in orange, yellow, white, beige, brown, even blue and purple, believe it or not. Okay, the other thing that the bees collect is called propolis. Propolis is a bee glue, basically. It's a glue that the bees make out of resins that they collect from the trees. As you can see, the bees love to glue everything together, which is why I need to use my hive tool to get it out, because every time you go in, they stick it back together. You break it apart, they stick it back together. They also use it to fill in any holes that are in the hive or any cracks to keep the weather out. And the fourth thing that they gather is water. Okay, bees control the temperature in the hive all year round. They maintain in the hive 90 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. So in the summer, when your hive is out in the sun and it's 105 degrees out, the bees, you'll see them out here, and maybe we can see this. Ah, we can. So take a look down here. You see these bees fanning their wings? What they're doing is they're creating ventilation in the hive. And typically, in a larger hive outside, without an upper entrance, you'd see some with their heads facing in over here, and others with their heads facing out over here. And what they're doing is they're creating ventilation in the hive. And you can actually put your hand or your face up to the hive and feel that airflow. That's how good they are at it. Okay? In the winter, they also maintain 90 degrees. So in the middle of the winter, when it's 0 and there's 3 feet of snow out, in the middle of that hive is 90 degrees for the bees. And they do this by clustering together into a ball. And what they do is they exercise their wing muscles, and that generates heat. And they generate enough heat that they stay together in this tight ball called a cluster. What happens is the bees on the outside, as they get cold, they migrate into the inside. The bees that are on the inside that are nice and warm, they migrate to the outside. Anybody has any questions, they can fire away anytime. We're going to see if we can't find the queen. All right, so I told you about the queen. That's one type of bee. There's only one queen in the hive. I told you about the worker bees. But the third type of bee that's in the hive is called a drone. And, oh, there's the queen. Woohoo! There's the queen right at the top of the frame.
Yep, that's here.
Right there.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
You see how much bigger her abdomen is? And she's got very short wings. Okay? That's the queen right here. Okay, and you see how much different? She's bigger than the other bees. My favorite question. I'm not getting bit because honeybees are very gentle. They're not really aggressive at all. And if I drop this frame, skunks and bears. Other than that, I mean, this is probably about as bad as it gets. These poor bees have been opened up 4 or 5 times today in a confined space by me. I'm invading their house now, and they're still not attacking me. The smoke does two things. It makes them think that there's a forest fire. They gorge themselves on honey, anticipating that they're going to have to leave. And when they have a full belly of honey, they're very docile. And the second thing is they give off chemical signals called an alarm pheromone. So when one of them gets agitated, it gives off the pheromone, and all of a sudden the whole hive is agitated. Well, the smoke masks that pheromone so that they can't say, hey, Bob's coming in the hive, let's go get him.
That's why you don't get bit.
That's, but yes, I'll tell you honestly, yesterday I worked the hive all day long with no smoke, and I didn't get stung at all.
You don't want to scare the bees. Don't do that.
So it's just that bees by nature are very gentle. Okay, the beekeeper is constantly trying to improve his bees. So you try to breed your bees that are gentle. So you breed for gentleness, you breed for honey production, the ones that give you a lot of honey, and you breed for disease resistance. Okay? And you can do that simply by replacing the queen. So if you have a hive that's a great honey producer, you want to reproduce that queen, okay, and put her in some of your other hives. And that's what the beekeeper does. He looks at who are the good and who are the survivor colonies that make it over the winter, and those are the ones that he wants to perpetuate. So again, let's look and see. The queen is on this frame. See if I can find her again. For those of you who haven't seen her.
Does each one of the boards have a queen?
No, there's only one queen in the entire hive. Okay?
Why does it look like there's uniform holes on like the bottom of the frame? Is that just
Down there?
Yeah.
That's an area where they've just chewed the wax out.
Hey.
Are you having a problem with your bees losing them? I know a lot of honey farmers.
Yeah, so, typically there's a certain amount of loss of bees over the winter. Some of them starve to death, some of them the queen dies. And years ago, say back in the 60s and 70s, probably the winter loss rate was somewhere around 10%. So you'd lose 1 out of 10 hives. Right now, a typical loss might be 20 to 25%. Well, what happened back in 2006 was all of a sudden the beekeepers were finding that they were suffering 50, 60, even 70% losses, which is devastating for the large beekeepers that are dependent on this for their income. And it really wasn't understood what was happening and why, and it still really isn't. It got a little bit better in 2007, seemed to improve a little in 2008, but in 2009, there were pretty severe losses again. And this year, it hasn't been too bad on the East Coast, but the West Coast, there's been quite a few losses. So it's called colony collapse disorder. What's happening to the bees is you have a beautiful, healthy hive that's full of honey. It's got plenty of brood, plenty of bees, a good queen. You come down one day to look at your bees, and they're all gone. There's brood left in the hive. There's plenty of honey left in the hive. Where did they go, and why did they go? We don't really know. There's a couple of factors. One is the use of pesticides to grow our foods. So a lot of the foods that we eat today are genetically modified crops. These crops are treated with pesticides called neonicotinoids. Okay, it's based on nicotine, which is a very strong poison. It's a systemic pesticide, which means it gets into the roots and the leaves and all parts of the plant, which is why they use it. When the bees eat that pollen, or when they drink the water that transpires out of those plants, if they eat enough of it, it kills them. If they don't eat enough, it just suppresses their immune system. So these neonicotinoids have been banned in Europe because we know that they kill honeybees, but they're still marketed here in the U.S. and they're used on a large majority of the crops that we eat. So pesticides is one reason. The other is related to a parasite that was introduced into the country in 1985. It's called the varroa mite. Came from Southeast Asia and was brought over into the U.S. And the bees have no natural defense against this mite because they've never seen it before. And the mite carries bee viruses that also weaken the bee's immune system or sometimes can kill the colonies outright. And the third factor I think that's involved right now is the beekeepers' reaction to these mites when they came over in 1980 and 1985 was to use pesticides in the hives to kill the mites. Well, the pesticide residues are stored in the wax, so the poor bees are being exposed to pesticides when they're foraging, pesticides in the hive that are left over, and these mites that are carrying viruses that are weakening their immune systems. Recently, the latest research shows that they've also isolated a fungus in the hives of these bees that collapse. They don't know whether the fungus causes the collapse or whether the weakened hive allows the fungus to grow. But the short answer to the question is we don't know what's been happening to the bees, and they're still in pretty serious trouble. What else do we want to do? We want to see what the larvae look like.
You can show them the capped brood.
So what you've got here is this, see the little larva looks like a little white worm? Okay, that's the larval stage. So what happens is the queen will lay an egg. The egg hatches after 3 days. It turns into this little larval stage, a little white worm or grub. They feed the grub until it's about 8 or 9 days old, and then it becomes a pupa, at which time it gets capped. So these are capped brood right here, and after 21 days they hatch. If we're lucky, we might be able to see one hatching. We had one at the earlier show where we could actually watch the bee being born. Well, let's see if we can find the queen again. I'll show everyone the queen.